has been brought to you by the letter L.
Alright, so today we're doing L, and L stands for something that is increasingly recognized as a specific subdiscipline within the study of archaeology, and that would be landscape archaeology. Now, it's been around for quite a while, and a quick Google search has revealed that a bunch of universities are offering degrees and specializations in it. And also, a quick Google search for landscape archaeology books reveals that there's quite a lot of literature out there, although I am in the UK, so this list kind of reflects that, but you get the point. So, what is landscape archaeology, and why has it become so integral to the study of archaeology in general? Well, it's actually a little bit more complicated than it sounds. At its base, landscape archaeology is the study of how human society has affected the land, and in turn, how the land has affected human society. It's a two-way street. This is very different than looking at a single artifact, or an assemblage, or a building, in that here, with landscape archaeology, the frame of reference is bigger. It's something like a village, or a county, or even a whole country that we're studying. So to take an example in my world, let's think about an Iron Age village. Why is it all the way up there on the hilltop when it could be down in the valley near to the water source? And that's where it was during the Bronze Age. Why did that change? How did the landscape suggest that place for the village? How did the people alter the landscape to accommodate that village? Within the village, what's this space over here on the side? Was that reserved for elites or a priestly class, whereas the rest of the commoners were over here? And how did the subsistence patterns change over time? Animal husbandry, domesticated crops. How did that evolve over time? As you can see, landscape archaeology pulls in a lot of subdisciplines and techniques even within itself. Just in this little example we talked about, we'd be using LiDAR, we'd be doing pollen analysis, just to answer some of those basic questions of landscape archaeology. Now, as I mentioned, it's been around a long time, so let's sort of start at the beginning of the study. Exactly 100 years ago in 1924, archaeologist Alfred Kidder, who had spent decades in the American Southwest and in Central America, published an introduction to the study of Southwestern archaeology, a meticulous multidisciplinary study into whole areas and regions within the Southwest. Landscape archaeology advanced further in the 1950s and 60s when Graham Clark pioneered environmental archaeology, in which he focused on the interplay between human societies and the natural environment around them. And he did this most notably at Starcar and the region around it, which was a Mesolithic site in northern England that existed actually at the time of Doggerland, an area which connected Britain to the continent of Europe. And if I'm not mistaken, someone can fact check me on this, I think that was one of the very first archaeological projects that incorporated radiocarbon dating, way back, I think in the late 40s actually. And finally, the discipline took another great leap forward in the 1970s, when Ian Hodder led his post-processual revolution in archaeology.
There he is!
Now, we don't need to rehash a lot of old material. If you want to learn more about that, it's in A of the ABCs of archaeology. But essentially, the post-processualists wanted to reintroduce a bunch of perspectives and questions that they felt that the very sciencey new archaeology in the 1960s had stripped away. So, for example, cognitive perspectives, gendered perspectives, questions about agency and symbolism, etc. They wanted to bring this back into the interpretation of archaeology. So Hodder called landscape archaeology spatial archaeology. And as post-processualism developed and took a lot of different directions along various threads, landscape archaeology developed along with it. And to emphasize the two-way relationship between human society and the landscape, we now speak of cultural landscapes. And in fact, UNESCO started recognizing those cultural landscapes in 1992, and it designates those just like UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Well, when we say cultural landscapes, that entails three different kinds of spaces. First, we have material, and this refers to the way space is literally divided up and broken up and used. So, for example, think way back to one of our, I believe, the first archaeology news segment with all of those landscapes that were discovered underneath the jungle in Ecuador. They were linked by roads. There were different areas designated that looked like for farming and for villages, etc. The way space is literally broken up, that's material space. Second, there's social space. This is how people interact with each other and the landscape within the material space. So for an example, think about Knossos, which we did in a recent site visit. There were different spaces that were reserved for the commoners and for them to mix, for more dignitaries and, high status people to meet with the priests. And generally, the further you got into the space, the more sort of refined and elite and important the activities and people going on there were. Now, that may seem a bit off because Knossos is kind of a giant structure as opposed to a whole landscape, although there is a whole landscape around Knossos where we can figure out how it was fed and how people got to and from it. But anyway, yes, Knossos is kind of like a giant building. But this sort of social concept of space is even used for villages and even particular households where they look at debris on old floors and sort of see how that space was divided up and who occupied what area, etc. Anyway, that's another story, but you got the concept of social space, how people interact with each other and the landscape within the material space. And thirdly, there's cognitive space. This is how people understand their social and material space and their place within it. To get a better idea of this, let's think about one of our early site visits to Lipinski Vir. Now, if you'll recall, that was a small village which had these very strangely shaped floor plans to the houses, and those seemed to reflect a mountain that overlooked the area, which blocked out the sun in the mornings and was actually the scene of a double sunrise during, I think it was the summer solstice. So those people clearly had some deeper understanding of where they belonged in that landscape and how the different things related to each other. And remember, it was also right along a river. And we know that in ancient times, people often had very specific ideas about sort of the power and the sanctity of water. So people probably had a quite highly evolved cognitive understanding of this whole landscape around them at Lipinski Vir. And so, as interpretive archaeology took off, so did landscape archaeology in the post-processual movement. I think a great example of that among one of Ian Hodder's students is Mike Parker Pearson, my professor who we interviewed on this show. Now, Mike is most known for his interpretation of Stonehenge, which has probably stood up better than any other until this day. And remember, he did that by looking at Stonehenge as part of a much wider landscape that encompassed other ancient monuments and the ways that people traveled between those monuments.
I thought about what we actually knew. It made me realize that actually, yes, well, our Stonehenge landscape does indeed have circles of timber at one end of the river and a circle of stone, Stonehenge itself, down the other. And maybe he's got a point there.
And finally, the development of landscape archaeology was greatly encouraged and aided by the development of technologies like LiDAR and drones and geophysics, which really help us develop advanced mapping techniques of whole areas and sort of see what's going on and how the different parts of the site or different sites relate to one another. And just like geophysics, landscape archaeology broke out into the popular culture with Time Team, and they had their own resident landscape archaeologist, Stuart Ainsworth.
And what we've got is a quite clear pattern of a regular enclosure here within which we think the villa sits, something like that. But interestingly, all around it, we've got patterns of what appear to be fields.
And fun fact, Stuart Ainsworth, Stuart is my middle name.
Shut up, Stuart. We're trying to watch TV.
Okay, so if we've degenerated to Beavis and Butthead, that probably means it's time to put a lid on this one. So yeah, landscape archaeology. now an indispensable part of the wider discipline. L for landscape archaeology. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.